Hej och välkomna till Udda Ting, en podcast om sällsamma historier, kreativitet och kreatörerna själva. Mitt namn är Henrik Möller, musiken är skapad av Testbild och loggan till podden är gjord av Malmökonstnären Nalle Chinsky. Det här avsnittet ska handla om regissören Paul Morrisseys filmer Blood for Dracula och Frankenstein. Tidigare kända som popkonstnären Andy Warhols Blood for Dracula och Flesh for Frankenstein. Jag valde att kalla det här avsnittet för det här och jag vet att Morrissey själv, hade han fått reda på detta så hade han fått ett raseriutbrott. Morrisseys filmer har ända sedan debuten stått i skuggan för Andy Warhols namn på affischerna. Tyvärr så var det ju faktiskt också att det var Warhols namn på filmerna som sålde in dem, annars hade de med stor sannolikhet inte blivit av. Men som sagt, detta störde Morrissey något extremt och han är än idag bitter i intervjuer när han pratar om Warhol.
He couldn't influence anybody. He was incapable of doing anything. He was so severely autistic with dyslexia and Asperger's disease. He couldn't read, he couldn't write, and he couldn't speak. He had no ideas about anything, nothing. That he could go out and say hi, that was it. But that he did it his whole life, you got to give him credit. Beyond that, he could do nothing, nor did he try, or even suggest that he could do something.
Morrissey hade jobbat länge för Warhol på hans filmer, men hans så kallade trilogi som startar med Flesh och sedan Trash och sist Heat är inspirerad av bland annat John Cassavetes filmer Shadows och Faces. En dokumentär smutsig diskbänksrealism med handhållen kamera i naturliga miljöer. Morrissey hade känt sig låst i Warhols studiofilmer och han ville nu ut på gatorna bland vanligt folk. På denna tiden så kostade pengar att filma på New Yorks gator och man behövde också tillstånd. Morrissey sket i detta och filmade ändå, något som Warhol aldrig skulle vågat sig på. Trilogin fokuserar till skillnad från Cassavetes filmer mer på samhällets botten. Missbrukare, konstnärer, transsexuella som lever i förfallna, skitiga, kackerlacksinfesterade New York-lägenheter. Flesh handlar om Joe som blir utslängd av sin flickvän som han redan har ett barn med för att gå ut och tjäna pengar till hennes abort. Det går inget vidare för Joe och han börjar slutligen att prostituera sig själv på gatan. Samtliga filmer har amatörer i princip alla rollerna. Filmerna följer ett slappt synopsis med förslag till dialog skriven på papperslappar av Morrissey själv och dialogen improviserade sedan fram. Detta var ett nytt grepp som imponerade på mig när jag själv började göra film. Inte bara att amatörer använde sina egna ord utan att också miljöerna spelade en så stor och viktig roll. Väldigt stämningsfulla scener där huvudpersonerna vandrar genom sunkiga kvarter i New York. Paul Morrissey sa att han gjorde filmer om personligheter, alltså karaktärer, och ju bättre, mer karismatisk karaktär, desto bättre film. Han menade på att hans stories inte var så mycket att ha, men att han var bra på att hitta bra karaktärer som kunde skriva sina egna dialoger i filmen som var bättre än det han själv hade kunnat leverera. Men vem var då Paul Morrissey? Filmvetaren Troy Howarth berättar.
I have the sort of generic background information. He was born in 1938, February of 1938, so he'll be turning 80 next month. New York born and, came from a sort of strong Catholic background. Became very interested in making films, but earlier on he had worked in a variety of different jobs as far as I can tell. Sort of bounced around doing different things until he sort of happened onto the Andy Warhol factory, as it was known. It was kind of a happening spot in the mid-60s. It would have been around 65 that he became a part of that sort of scene. And although he was kind of a fish out of water in it, because whether it's true or not, it was at the very least perceived as being a very sort of hedonistic kind of an atmosphere with a lot of drugs. A lot of sex, a lot of drinking, and things like that. And Morrissey, being a good Catholic boy, was not part of that. As a matter of fact, he was described, I forget who it was that said it, but they described him as being sort of, he was the 9 to 5 guy. He was the guy that clocked in the morning and actually comported himself like a businessman as opposed to being sort of an eccentric artist type. But he saw Warhol as being a good kind of a bridge to being able to make movies, because of course Warhol himself was experimenting with making movies, but his films were very, very crude. And Warhol had a kind of a conceit, very strange conceit, that film was only art if the camera was static. So he would do these sort of famous experimental films like there's a movie called Sleep, which is just basically the camera's at the foot of somebody's bed and films him sleeping all night long. Or the Empire State Building film, which is just a static shot of the Empire State Building. So the titles were always very kind of self-explanatory, but they were very, very different from what Morrissey wanted. Morrissey loved old school Hollywood films. He loved glamour, and he loved that kind of stylization. And the 60s, as we know, was kind of a tumultuous period altogether in every respect, but certainly that was the changeover from the studio period, which Morrissey really admired. He admired directors like Joseph von Sternberg, for example, who were very concerned with glamour and with always making sure that things were sort of pretty and very stylish, and there was a real appreciation of how actresses were made up in the films, for example, good costuming and nice makeup and lighting. He appreciated all that sort of thing, and so he and Warhol had very different ideas of what would constitute a film, but once he became a part of the Andy Warhol sort of factory, he gradually, because he was, let's face it, probably more with it and more together in many respects than Warhol and a lot of his other associates. He wasn't sort of addled by a lot of drugs and so forth. He had good business sense, and Warhol sort of made him into his business manager in most every area of his career, except with regards to his artwork. That was something that Warhol insisted on maintaining control of. But especially with the film aspect, that was very much something that Morrissey could bring a more stable, steadying influence to it. And he, gradually introduced the idea of making films with plots.
It's interesting that it was all about glamour, and yet his films was all about poverty.
I think in a way that was almost a necessity, because those films were made very, very improvised and extremely low budget. And I don't think that there was really the facilities for glamour. To be honest with you, I don't think he really had access to it. So I think he took what could have been a liability and turned it into a strength by making them into sort of what you would call slice of life type movies. These are sort of focusing on kind of ordinary people, although again with his very sort of conservative attitude and very Catholic attitude, probably really not characters that he particularly admired. He had a good business sense that he understood that sex sold, and he was happy to put as much sex and nudity as he could in his films, but he wasn't doing it in a way that I don't think his films were meant to be erotic. I think he was playing them up as absurd. He wanted to show up the absurdity of sex, for example, and that kind of came out of his very conservative mindset.
It's also interesting that since Morrissey is described as politically a right-winger.
He did, and it's funny because you wouldn't necessarily, if you were watching like the two horror films, The Flesh for Frankenstein and Blood for Dracula, you wouldn't necessarily assume that they were made by a man who described himself as being a right-winger, but they were. And when you look at them with that in mind, aspects of the plot make more sense, and you can understand where he was coming from, that he's sort of mourning traditional values at the same time while playing up how distasteful he finds a lot of what could be termed modern society. So you see that in those early films as well. I mean, they do focus on fringe types, junkies and prostitutes and male prostitutes, female prostitutes, and transsexuals and transvestites. These are people that were very marginalized, and I think it was very groundbreaking that he showed them on screen the way that he did. I don't know, as you say, I don't know that I would say that he necessarily despised these people. I don't think that he did, but his own personal political views are much more right-wing than you would necessarily automatically assume just from casually seeing those movies.
Blood and Flesh were presented by Warhol, but it seemed that they had parted ways at this point in time in 1974 when he made Flesh and Blood.
Still with Warhol. He was really with Warhol for about 10 years, from around the mid-60s till the mid-70s. Warhol was still a part, or I should say he was still part of Warhol's factory through that time. Eventually he parted ways with him, but it was always, it's an interesting thing, the Warhol Morrissey dynamic. It's difficult to get a straight answer from Morrissey himself, because Morrissey is extremely, in many respects, very bitter on the topic of Warhol, and because Warhol's name was attached to so many, let's be honest, to most of his best films, it makes him very touchy on that subject. I have friends who have interviewed Morrissey, and Morrissey at this point is just extremely adamant that Warhol was too wasted to contribute much of anything, which is probably true. But nevertheless, there's no erasing the fact that Warhol was an incredibly important part of his life.
Morrissey himself has always bared a grudge against Warhol and talking about his incompetence in several interviews.
I don't know that we can look to Morrissey for a really unbiased kind of take on Warhol's abilities and so forth. I think that when he came into the scene, he saw Warhol as kind of a stepping stone towards what he wanted to achieve, which was to make films independently, and he was able to do that, because there's absolutely no way that he would have been able to make the kind of films that he wanted to make in the conventional studio system, which, again, makes it even more ironic that was something that he really held in such high esteem. But again, like I said, there's a certain making a virtue out of the things that are imposed on you. So I think he just knew, he understood how to work with the tools he had at his disposal. And Warhol was such a significant cultural force at that time. I'm sure that Morrissey saw the best and the worst aspects of him, but I think a lot of it came down to the fact that because Warhol's name was splashed across the posters very large, where Morrissey's name was rather small, naturally enough, it just made him a little bit bitter over a period of time.
But now, really quickly, for those people who don't know what Flesh for Frankenstein and Blood for Dracula is all about.
Morrissey respected the genre, and he respected conventions. Morrissey was not a fan of the contemporary horror films that were being made. He explicitly said he did not like the Hammer films, for example, which will, of course, enrage all the Hammer film fans. Don't get me wrong, I love Hammer films myself, but a lot of Hammer film fans tend to get very irritated when they hear that people don't like their movies. But he loved the Todd Browning Dracula from 1931, and he loved the Boris Karloff, James Whale Frankenstein from 1931. So they both are respectful of the genre, but they both kind of turn things on their head. So in Flesh for Frankenstein, you have a Baron Frankenstein who is basically, he almost comes across like a sort of Nazi surgeon who is looking to create a master race. I mean, that's basically what he's trying to do. He's trying to create the two ideal-looking people who are very, very Aryan-looking. And you'll notice in the film, the female, he refers to them as zombie, which is funny. They're not zombies, but well, maybe they are zombies in a way. I don't know. But they're the two creatures, the two monsters, whatever, one of whom is Dalila de Lazzaro, who went on to be in Dario Argento's Phenomena as the headmistress. And she was in a very good giallo called The Pajama Girl Murder, which is actually based on a true story. But they're both tall, lean, both have fantastic profiles. They both are very attractive, blue eyes, blonde hair. I mean, what does that tell you? They're very the sort of master race that he's trying to create. And so he creates a male and a female. He brings them to life, and the idea is that he wants them to mate. But of course, as things always do in these movies, it doesn't go according to plan. And the male creature, I believe, it's never explicitly stated in the film, but I have a notion that the male creature would more like to make love with Joe D'Alessandro than he would with the intended mate. So everything just ends up going very poorly, and it really ends up with this almost sort of Shakespearean finale of bodies upon bodies in the lab, and just absolute grand guignol on a grand scale. I'm not sure whether Monty Python and the Holy Grail took inspiration from these films. I kind of suspect they might have done, depending on the timeline, because Flesh for Frankenstein came out in 73, Blood for Dracula came out in 74, Holy Grail came out in 74. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Pythons saw these movies with their sort of massive arterial spray scenes that happen, limbs being hacked off and so forth.
I guess you're right that this is probably the main issue people have with these films. For me, the humor is the best part of them, and if they predated Monty Python, this also means that they predated Romero's Dawn of the Dead and Peter Jackson's splatter comedies. Although you can tell that these films were made by an artist, the farcical elements are not, shall we say, the Three Stooges or Peter Jackson's brain-dead type of farce, but something more weird and quirky. People usually call the films camp, a sort of a degrading word, I guess.
I think a lot of people went in expecting straight horror films, and and they are horror films. I wouldn't say they're parodies. I wouldn't describe them as parodies. They're sort of satires in a way. They're very dark comedies, but I don't think a lot of people understood. I suspect what happened was when a lot of people went and saw it, if they laughed, they thought it was unintentionally funny. I don't think that they realized that it was meant to be funny. So I think a lot of people just didn't quite understand, what to make of it. Whereas we go into a Monty Python film, you're supposed to laugh. So I think that had something to do with it.
I have a story that kind of ties into this. I'll tell it real quickly. There was a Stanley Kubrick mockumentary called Dark Side of the Moon, made in France, I believe, with the Kubrick family acting in it. The plot of that mockumentary was that Stanley Kubrick had used the sets from 2001 to fake the moon landing. The film starts out really seriously, and it gradually goes more and more silly and crazy and absurd, until the end when the end credits roll, you see the bloopers from the movie. But when the movie was over, I was the only person in the audience that had understood that this was a mockumentary, that this was fake. And everybody's, you never know. And I got crazy. I said, please, people, stop this madness. You're scaring me. And that's when I understood that the setup of the movie is extremely important. If you hook the audience with a serious setup, it's very, very hard to break that later on. And I think that's kind of what happened to Dracula and Frankenstein, especially with Dracula, that starts out with Udda Ting putting on makeup in the mirror and this serious music playing in the background. For instance, if the vomiting scene where Udda Ting turns green in the face, if that had come at the beginning of the movie, that would have been a setup for telling even the most stupid people in the audience that this is a comedy, you're supposed to laugh.
I have to say, it's a funny thing to say this, but it's probably the best vomiting scene of all time. He really does look like he's throwing up. An incredible performance from Udda Ting, and of course the use of the green lighting on his face. And, it's incredible. Again, people don't. I think, first of all, a lot of people are very, very snobby when it comes to genre cinema. So there is kind of a thought process that horror films and so forth are usually schlock. And a lot of horror films are bad, but of course a lot of films in general are bad. But when you have something that has a kind of absurd slant to it, and it has humor, people don't always get that. Even when you think about a really truly terrifying movie like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which is a truly white-knuckle sort of ride of a movie. It's a really frightening film, but it's also funny. There are scenes in that film that are funny, and they're meant to be funny, and people don't always get that. Dawn of the Dead has a lot of humor in it. And so because a lot of people go into a lot of genre films in general thinking, oh, this is just some campy schlock. And again, people misuse the word camp all the time. This is just some cheap piece of schlock or whatever. I'm just going to make fun of it. If that's how you approach a movie, then of course you're not going to appreciate it. You're not going to understand it. And so the people that went to see, we call them Andy Warhol's Frankenstein and Andy Warhol's Dracula in America for many years. That's how they were titled. There was this perception that they were quote-unquote serious movies that are just unintentionally funny, is completely ridiculous and way off the mark. They were definitely meant to be funny, and they are funny, and that's okay. Just to recap the Dracula film real quick, in terms of plot, that film deals with a Dracula who is could be described as sort of a victim of the modern age. He needs virgin blood in order to survive, and here it is set sort of approximately around the 1920s, I think it's meant to be, and the morals have declined, and everybody is out fucking everybody else, and so he doesn't have a steady source of blood to drink from. So he goes to on a trip to Italy with his servant to find they find some virgins to get blood from. They come upon this aristocratic family, the Di Fiore family, which is in a state of absolute decay themselves. They don't have any money. The father, played by Vittorio De Sica, has a title but no money, and what little money he's got, he's going off and gambling all the time. And basically, they settle on this family thinking, well, they're a good Catholic family, so they must have daughters who have pure blood. But of course, the daughters are all having sex with Joe D'Alessandro, who is the sort of Marxist, very obnoxious handyman gardener who hates the aristocracy and is just waiting for another sort of Russian Revolution to come along, where the poor are going to uprise against the upper crust, the upper class people, and it just ends up very poorly indeed for poor Dracula in that movie.
Well, Dracula isn't exactly the bad guy in the film. He's powerless and fragile and worries about his clothes and how he looks, and he wants to bring his butterfly collection on the trip. The opposition in this case is the handyman, played by Joe D'Alessandro, who wants to rebel against the aristocrats, and he's a real asshole. So I wonder, how intentional was this?
Again, if you watch these films without an understanding of what Morrissey is like, you might interpret them differently. In a way, I don't know, it reminds me a little bit, I don't know if you're familiar with a British director named Pete Walker, who made a series of very violent horror films in the 70s. And Walker's movies were very controversial, and they seemed to really be taking potshots at the conservative government. But in fact, Walker was himself very conservative, and he was only doing that to just get controversy. He knew that if he did these things, that it would cause outrage and it would be good for business. So it was kind of a cynical attitude in a way. On Dracula, at the very least, I think we can state with absolute certainty, there's absolutely no way that we can regard Mario, the character played by Joe D'Alessandro, as a good guy. He's an ass the whole way through. He's incredibly disrespectful towards the sisters. He rapes the one at the end of the film. He literally rapes her. There's a scene. It's a very funny scene, but in a way, I think it's probably Morrissey's commentary on sort of communism and Marxism and so forth, where D'Alessandro is naked in bed, and he's sort of on his knees on the bed, and the sort of hammer and sickle is on the wall, and he's talking with Stefania Cassini, and in order to shut her up, he basically forces her down to give him a blowjob in front of this hammer and sickle. So I think that there's no way we can regard him as a positive or even likable character. He's incredibly unsympathetic. Dracula, I think for Morrissey, in a weird sort of way, represents a bygone era of a better time, when people actually had moral standards and decency, and he represents tradition in a weird sort of way. So when at the end of the film, when he's destroyed and he's literally, he's reduced to a pile of body parts on the floor, is that meant to be a happy ending? I don't think it plays like a happy ending, even down to the music. It's that same sort of very sad, melodic music that you hear at the beginning of the film. I don't think it's really meant to be a happy ending. That there is something arguably a little twisted about that, I guess. But I think that, Dracula, he's part of the aristocracy, he's literally a bloodsucker. It's that very obvious sort of political schism there between him and the working class Marxist sort of anti-hero. But there's no doubt that Morrissey's sympathy is with Dracula as opposed to the Mario character.
Let's move on to the topic of this episode. How did the deal for the films of Frankenstein and Dracula come about?
It all, funnily enough, started with Roman Polanski, because Roman Polanski had gone to Italy. This was during the period of time after Sharon Tate had been murdered by the Manson clan. He was going through obviously a very difficult and unpleasant period of time, and in a way, unfairly, obviously extremely unfairly, I think there was an attitude in the American press that kind of, even at that time, was vilifying Polanski a little bit, as sort of implying that he brought all of these problems onto Sharon Tate by virtue of the fact that he was dabbling in sort of occult subject matter, with Rosemary's Baby, and this was kind of you don't mess around with the devil. Look what happens to you when you do. So he had gone to Italy during this period of time in the early 70s before he bounced back in a big way with Chinatown. And he made a film for Carlo Ponti called What, also known as Diary of Forbidden Dreams. A very bizarre, not exactly psychedelic, but almost a sort of very surreal version of Alice in Wonderland with a lot of sex and eroticism. And Carlo Ponti apparently very much wanted Polanski to shoot that movie in 3D. Polanski realized that 3D just wasn't suited to that subject matter. Ponti kept after him about, wants to do something in 3D. Do you have any ideas? I'd like to do something in 3D. And Polanski had met Paul Morrissey at, I think it was the premiere of Heat, which was a slightly, I don't want to say mainstream, but a slightly bigger, probably commercial success than the earlier films because in addition to Joe D'Alessandro, you had a Oscar-winning actress, and it's Sylvia Miles, who had just won an Oscar a couple years before for Midnight Cowboy. And it was kind of a Morrissey version of Sunset Boulevard in a way. And Polanski had seen this film and liked it very much. And he pretty much just suggested to Carlo Ponti, well, why don't you bring Paul Morrissey over and do a version of Frankenstein in 3D? It just seemed to be a largical idea, in a sense, if you're going to do something in 3D. I mean, at that time, 3D had mostly, not entirely, but largely been used for horror films and films of that type, genre films. So the idea of a 3D Frankenstein just seemed to make a certain degree of sense, and I think Polanski realized that Morrissey would be a pretty inspired choice for something like that. And so he suggested this to Carlo Ponti, and Ponti sent for Polanski sent his producer, Andrew Bronsberg, over to New York to meet with Morrissey, and the deal was suggested to Morrissey that he'd come over to Rome and make this movie for Carlo Ponti in 3D. Obviously, it was right up his alley in the sense that it was an opportunity to go and do a kind of a costume movie, a kind of a more sort of proper, quote-unquote, proper movie, the likes of which he'd been trying to make. And who wouldn't want to go to Rome, 1973, to go make a film in 3D? It just sounded like a wonderful idea, so he came over, and it all went from there.
Yes, but how did the deal for this one film that later became two, and then being shot back to back, come about?
Yeah, well, what happened, according to Morrissey, was when he went to meet with Carlo Ponti, bear in mind, Carlo Ponti had made films like Dr. Zhivago. He made huge movies that were very, very lavish. And here's Paul Morrissey coming from New York, who's only made these little films in sort of 16 millimeter improvised films. For really, they weren't completely without scripts. They would have outlines, but the dialogue and situations and so forth would be ad-libbed by the actors. So the background for him was obviously coming from making films that were very, very cheap indeed. So when he met with Carlo Ponti, I guess that, neither Polanski nor Andrew Bronsberg had sort of warned him ahead of time, well, have some idea of what a movie like this is going to cost. And Morrissey just, when Ponti asked him, well, how much money do you think it would cost and how long will you need to make it? Morrissey just threw out, I guess about $300,000, and I'll need about 3 weeks. Well, when Carlo Ponti heard that, he said, well, if you can make a movie for $300,000 in 3 weeks, why don't you make two for me? And, of course, Morrissey said, well, I'll be happy to. And at that point, Ponti said, well, what's the other movie going to be? And Morrissey had no clue. He had absolutely no idea about it whatsoever. And it was apparently Andrew Bronsberg who said, well, if you're going to make Frankenstein, why don't you follow up with a Dracula? And Morrissey said, yeah, that works. It really was as simple as that.
I'm also curious to what the script looked like. Morrissey always worked from a sort of synopsis type of script where the lines were never written. But now, working for a serious producer like Carlo Ponti, this must have made Ponti worried, I guess.
But according to Morrissey, what happened was because they were very low budget, Ponti wasn't as concerned as he would have been. I don't think Ponti involved himself in these films beyond just giving a good chunk of the budget to them. he asked Ponti ahead of time, do you mind if I use my usual method, which is to write an outline where we'll have the scenes and we'll know what sets we need. I mean, you have to have an idea what the sets are going to be, the costumes and all this stuff. I'll have an outline, but the dialogue I'd like to have ad-libbed. And Ponti said, well, if that's what you usually do, go ahead. Because it was only, for the 2 movies, $600,000. That's nothing to Carlo Ponti. So I think that his thought was, yeah, if you can do that, go ahead and do it. Morrissey quickly came to understand that that's okay in New York when you're working with actors to whom English is your first language. When you're working in Italy with Germans, Serbians, French, and so forth and so on, and they're not native English speakers, that's a big problem. So he claimed that the dialogue was written daily and handed to the actors in the morning so that they'd have an opportunity to sort of learn their lines. I don't know if all the actors even quite understood what they were saying, because some of them were probably speaking it phonetically, where, they would memorize the lines and they'd say them, but maybe they didn't quite understand. Although, funnily enough, the actor who probably sometimes sounds like he really doesn't understand what he's saying is the American, and that's Joe D'Alessandro, who has these very flat line readings sometimes where you wonder, does he even understand what he's saying? Whereas these Italian and French actors and so forth are much more expressive. But the idea was that they would be filmed without scripts. In the conventional sense of the term, they would have an outline. They would know what the scene was going to be, but the lines would be made up on the day. You can't do that with that kind of situation. So it worked for him in America, but it didn't work for him in Italy. So there is I think a thought process too that Morrissey has a tin ear for dialogue, that he just writes clunky lines and that's why the lines are funny. I don't think that's true at all. I think they're meant to be funny. And there's a lot of wit in both of those screenplays, a lot of very funny lines.
And for the films, Morrissey found quite a number of quite extraordinary actors.
There are certain actors, unfortunately, I'm not even going to try to pronounce their names, because there's a Serbian actor who is in Frankenstein, playing what Frankenstein calls the male zombie. He's a Serbian actor, and apparently he had met Morrissey at some point or another. This guy has no other credits apart from a little experimental film called, I remember Sonia Heaney, which was made a year or two before Flesh for Frankenstein. And Morrissey somehow was involved in that film, did a little acting appearance in it or something like that. It's just a little experimental thing. And so he had seen him before and liked his look. He was very tall. He was very aristocratic looking. He had a slightly sort of haughty quality to him. And so Morrissey thought, well, he'll be good casting for the Frankenstein monster. But then he figured, well, if I'm going to do Dracula, I think he'd be a good Dracula as well. Wish I knew how to pronounce this man's name, but I just know I'll mangle it if I try to. I guess throughout the process, as we'll talk about how these films were made, and Morrissey learned a lot of lessons early on that he had to adjust his methods somewhat, he became aware of the fact that this guy was probably really not going to work out very well playing the role of Dracula. But he already had Udo Kier, who was already at that point starting to build a little bit of a reputation for himself for doing a wide array of different movies. I think by this time he was already working with Fassbinder. If he wasn't, he was within a couple of years working in that sort of realm. But he'd also done films like, Mark of the Devil and so forth. So he was fairly up-and-coming name. And that Udo Kier did such a good job playing Frankenstein, it just seemed to make sense. Well, we might as well go ahead and have him for Dracula. As a matter of fact, he told a story on the Criterion Collection Laserdisc. Udo Kier talked about how when Frankenstein finished, it was the last day of filming. They'd done the last shots, and they were filming at that time at Cinecittà in Rome, the famous film studio that Fellini had shot so many films at. And he was feeling a little sad because the movie was finished, and he was having a little glass of wine with his lunch. And apparently Morrissey came up to him and said, well, I guess we're going to have a German Dracula. And Udo Kier said, who? And Morrissey said, "You." So he just cast him right there on the spot. The story goes that when Flesh for Frankenstein finished that very afternoon, the three actors that he carried over between the three films, Joe D'Alessandro, Arno Jürgen, and Udo Kier, were sent down to the makeup department and given haircuts, and they just started filming the second one right away that very same afternoon. So Joe D'Alessandro had, of course, been a part of Morrissey's career for a while already. It had been in Flesh, Trash, and Heat. So he was obvious casting to play the roles that he ended up playing in those films. Morrissey had originally, I believe, had an intention of bringing over some more American actors, but he discovered early on that because of the quota system, where you have to employ so many different members of different nationalities and so forth in the making of these movies. These were American, Italian, French financed films, primarily French-Italian, although apparently Warhol had some money in it, so that would account for a little bit of American financing. He was pretty much told, no, you can have one American actor, but the rest are going to have to be French and Italian primarily, although, as I said, there's a Serbian actor and some other nationalities as well. So Joe D'Alessandro was the one that he decided to keep. But yeah, I mean, by the time you get to Blood for Dracula, they not only do they have the three familiar names from the first film, Flesh for Frankenstein, but he was also able to get Vittorio De Sica, the great Italian neorealist filmmaker, to do a small role, and Roman Polanski happened to be back in Italy at that time on a little visit, and he said, well, why don't you put me in the film too? So Polanski actually appears in the film along with Andrew Bronsberg, the producer of Polanski films like What and The Tenant, and Polanski's screenwriting partner, Gerard Brock, who wrote most of Polanski's films from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and 90s even, is also in that scene. So it's a kind of an eclectic array of different actors, some of whom would become familiar in later films. The daughters in Blood for Dracula, for example, you have Stefania Cassini, for example, who went on to be in Suspiria, and was, I believe, at that time, if she wasn't at that time, she became Joe D'Alessandro's real-life girlfriend. So it's a weird array of actors and actresses. It's more professional, quote-unquote, professional casting than Morrissey's American films in a certain sense, but there are, I think, a fair amount of kind of just local, untested, interesting faces that he found and put into the movie as well.
The most interesting story of an unknown actor, at least for me, is the story of Arno Jürgen, Udo Kier's servant in the films. Apparently he was a lot younger than he looked. He looked like he was almost in his 30s, but he apparently was in his teens. His mother followed Paul Morrissey around bugging him to please put her son in one of his films. He really wanted to become an actor, so Morrissey did, and he delivered spectacularly, in particular in Dracula, where he's hilarious and outshines most of the cast. Sadly enough, I heard his career did not take off, and this was his last film that he made, and in despair later he killed himself.
He did do a couple of other things. He did do a film, a German thriller called, I think it's called School of Fear, which was directed by a director named Alfred Vorher, who directed a lot of the German Edgar Wallace films, and he's in that, not in a huge role, but he's in it. I think he did a couple of other things too, but he did kill himself, but I could be wrong, but I seem to recall that he killed himself because his mother passed away. He was very attached to his mother, and he killed himself after that.
The mother of actor Arno Jürgen is actually in the film, in Dracula. She plays the mother of the little girl in the tavern, so she plays against her own son in the film. It's an amazingly funny scene with Roman Polanski. It's one of the best scenes in the movie. And I've heard that this scene was not in the script originally, but Udo Kier had another thing on another movie, so he went away for a whole day and the crew didn't know what to do. So they decided to shoot yet another scene. And Roman Polanski came to Paul Morrissey's rescue and said, I have a little idea of something we could do. Let's shoot it.
Joe D'Alessandro and Udo Kier, what's really neat about the two films, especially if you watch them back to back, they get to play very, very different characters in the two films. You can basically say if one is likable in the one film, he's going to be very unlikable in the other film. And all three of them, I think that's very true of them in all three films. sorry, all two films, I should say, all three actors.
I'm curious how the hell he got a serious legendary actor like Vittorio De Sica to play in a film like this. It's quite mind-boggling.
That's a good question. I can only guess that that was Carlo Ponti, that somehow Morrissey would have thought, well, it'd be nice to get a kind of a classy name to play this small but important role, so who do you get? And De Sica, of course, wasn't just a great director. I mean, he certainly was a great director. If you've ever seen The Bicycle Thieves or Birds of the Deep, for example, they're masterpieces. But he was also a great actor. As a matter of fact, he was an Italian matinee idol. He was a very handsome young man and been a film star and a stage star. He's a damn good actor in addition to being a great director. Well, you could say the same of Polanski as well. Multi-talented people. I would imagine it was Carlo Ponti who just pretty much said, you know what, are you busy? Do you want to make a little bit of money to come out and film for a couple of days? And apparently De Sica, and this is an aspect we'll have to discuss, is the scripts for the film and how they were shot on that level. But De Sica apparently wrote his own dialogue for himself because Morrissey gave him a free hand to do that. So he wrote these wonderfully eccentric lines that you hear in the film where he's breaking down the name Dracula and how it sounds and how if you study the name and the syllables and all this sort of gobbledygook that he comes up with, we can tell this must be a good person, because he's got a good name.
Count Dracula. There are wine tasters and name tasters. Yes. Dracula, 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 Dracula.
One of the interesting things is that Italians are very fond of dubbing their films. They were at that time sort of masters at dubbing films. But Morrissey refused, and every actor in these two films speak English, no matter where they came from.
Morrissey was very clear on the point that he did not want any dubbing. He loved the accents. This was totally contrary to what you normally had with films. Even if you look like at the James Bond films or the Hammer films, for example, that were made around that time, if you had actors with strong accents, they usually were dubbed. And the thinking was, well, people will have a hard time understanding, which is bullshit. It's total bullshit. It was just a ridiculous kind of thought process that people got into. Morrissey wouldn't have any of it, so the films were shot entirely with live soundtracks, which was very, very unusual in Italian movies. Italian movies typically were shot, you don't want to say they were shot silent because that would be impossible. I mean, how would you put them together at the end and figure out how to cut and continuity and all that? But they would have very rough guide tracks where if dogs barked in the background or planes flew overhead and there was noises, it didn't really matter. You just film. And sometimes even Fellini would have actors just counting, just count to 7 and then pause and then count to 5 and then pause again. Morrissey wanted direct sound, and he had all these wonderful, wonderful accents at his disposal. So you have Udo Kier and Arno Jürning with very pronounced German accents, but they're totally easy to understand. And then you have Joe D'Alessandro, of course, bringing in this kind of Brooklyn accent, which is totally out of place, but that's part of the charm. De Sica and so forth. So every single person in the two films is, you hear the voice on the English track, I should say. You hear their real voices.
There was also a controversy regarding the Italian director Antonio Margheriti's involvement in the film. Tell the listeners who don't know who he was.
Antonio Margheriti, if you're at all versed in what you could call Italian cult cinema, was a director kind of like Mario Bava in a way, but I would say not nearly as gifted. Like Mario Bava, he was also a special effects technician. So he worked on a lot of big films. Like he worked for Sergio Leone, for example, on Fistful of Dynamite. And he did a lot of different films where he did special effects for people. Like Mario Bava, he was the kind of guy that would get called in if there were technical problems that needed to be fixed. Paul Morrissey, coming to these two films, has made a string of very, very low-budget movies, 16mm improvised films made in New York with non-professional actors. Very unorthodox kind of a thing. So I think Carlo Ponti was concerned that here he was coming over to make a movie, a costume movie, in 3D with lots of special effects, lots of gore. Carlo Rambaldi, the great special effects artist and protege of Mario Bava, was the special effects artist on the film. So I think the thinking was, well, there were a couple of thoughts. One of them was we need somebody on board who knows how to film special effects, who we can be sure will help Paul Morrissey out if he needs help, because he's never done a movie like this before. Even though it was low budget, they wanted to protect their investments. That's one thing. The other aspect was because of the Italian financing, Carlo Ponti was effectively looking to pull a fast one by putting an Italian on the titles as the director of the film, so that he could qualify for some different incentives and tax cuts and things like that. It didn't end up working. From what I can remember, I know I've read about this before in other sources, that eventually the subterfuge was found out, and Margheriti and Ponti were brought up on charges in the Italian courts, basically for fraud. Margheriti did work on Flesh for Frankenstein. There's some controversy whether he had anything whatsoever to do with Blood for Dracula, but Morrissey, depending on the mood you catch him in, will either say he directed a day's worth of second unit pickup shots, or he'll say he didn't do a goddamn thing. It depends on what sort of mood he's in when you talk to him about it, apparently. Margheriti claimed that he directed some of the scenes with Vittorio De Sica. Basically, Udo Kier, the main actors, have all said, I don't remember Antonio Margheriti whatsoever. I was directed by Paul Morrissey, so it's pretty clear Paul Morrissey definitely directed the films. But Flesh for Frankenstein, Margheriti, I think it's accepted as fact that Margheriti directed a lot of the scenes with the two little kids. If you remember, the Baron and Baroness have two children, one of whom is Nicoletta Elmi, a very creepy-looking little redheaded girl that was in Mario Bava's Baron Blood and Twitch of the Death Nerve, and she was in Dario Argento's Deep Red and Aldo Lato's Who Saw Her Die, amongst other things. If you wanted the creepy little redheaded girl in Italian movies, that was your girl in the 70s. And she showed up as a very, actually, surprisingly beautiful young woman as the ticket taker in Lamberto Bava's Demons in the mid-'80s. So I think he did direct those scenes because I would imagine that those two little kids probably didn't speak English, and it probably would have been easier because a lot of their scenes are disconnected from the main actors, that Margheriti would have filmed a lot of that stuff. So, for example, like the very opening of the film, the opening titles, the two kids are seen in the laboratory messing around, looking around in places they shouldn't be looking around in. That was Margheriti who directed that stuff. Nicoletta Elmi has confirmed that Margheriti directed her. But the bulk of the film certainly was directed by Paul Morrissey. But again, because a lot of people don't understand the trickery that goes on with the credits in some of these films, it's been said down through the years. And I've had debates with people who will be very insistent that, well, Antonio Margheriti directed these films. They don't look anything like Paul Morrissey films. If you know Antonio Margheriti's films that he's directed, they don't have nearly the same wit or intelligence as these two films do. So I think they're definitely Morrissey films, but Margheriti lent a little bit of sort of technical assistance here and there. As a director, he made films like Castle of Blood with Barbara Steele and Cannibal Apocalypse with John Saxon, and a good all-purpose journeyman director, but never, from my point of view, a real artist like Mario Bava was, for example.
Morrissey made a comment about special effects genius Carlo Rambaldi, who worked on both films. Rambaldi would later build mechanical effects for the first Alien, Dune, and Possession, and later Steven Spielberg's E.T. The comment, which I guess should not be taken too serious, was that he could build anything, but he could not come up with an idea for it.
I mean, Carlo Rambaldi already had a lot of years of experience under his belt. By the time he did this film, he had served as sort of an apprentice to Mario Bava. And if you were going to learn about special effects from anybody, Mario Bava was a pretty good person to learn from. He was a genius in his own way. And Rambaldi's work isn't always fantastic, but the best of it is quite good. I don't see any reason to doubt that Rambaldi delivered what was expected of him. It's possible that some of the things that he built may have malfunctioned, because that happened later when Bava turned down doing the special effects for the Dino De Laurentiis remake of King Kong, and he said, why don't you get Carlo Rambaldi to do it instead, because he didn't want to go to America to do the film. Rambaldi did spent, I forget how long, months and months building this mechanical wave that didn't work. So it's possible that there were some things that maybe Morrissey might have helped him a little bit with, but I mean, where can we base the idea that Morrissey would somehow have been responsible for special effects? There's nothing in his previous films or later films that have any kind of special effects, really. So I think, I think Morrissey sometimes is overcompensating, let's say. I think he's a little bit angry about sometimes getting screwed out of the credit that he deserves, so maybe sometimes he just goes too far in the other direction.
The films had amazing production values. There is no underground look here, like in Morrissey's previous films.
No. Well, this was the first chance he had. He had Enrico Job, who did fantastic sets, especially that laboratory set on Frankenstein. Now, Dracula did not have any sets built. That was all filmed on location. The villa, I want to say, that might be the villa for Scotti, which showed up in a lot of Italian horror films. I'm not 100% sure on that. But Frankenstein had a lot of sets, and they're wonderful. They have costumes, they have sets, they have magnificent cinematography from Luigi Cavalier, who's a brilliant cinematographer, who worked with Dario Argento and Lucio Fulci and Billy Wilder. Just a great cinematographer. I mean, this was his first opportunity to have a movie with a bit of, quote-unquote glitz and glamour, and he obviously took advantage of it.
I mean, on Hound of the Baskervilles, he had legendary Dick Bush as a photographer.
Oh, yeah, the Hound of the Baskervilles, which is kind of an anomaly, let's say, in his filmography, in the sense that Morrissey typically wrote and directed his own films. On Hound of the Baskervilles, he was slightly encumbered by the fact that Peter Cook and Dudley Moore, who were a very, very popular comedy duo, pretty much wrote the script and had a little bit more control. But on Hound of the Baskervilles, he originally started with a cinematographer named John Wilcox, who was an associate of Freddie Francis, who was one of the great British cinematographers and a pretty good director, but a great cinematographer. But John Wilcox became terminally ill. He was diagnosed with cancer, I believe, early on, so he was replaced by Dick Bush. Of course, Dick Bush had photographed films for Ken Russell and so forth and so on. So, I mean, yeah, when he had access to the good technicians, he made use of them. I mean, I don't know quite how he settled on Luigi Cavalier, for example, to shoot the two Italian films. That may have been a Carlo Ponti decision, but he was a perfect choice because the lighting in both of those films is absolutely gorgeous. They're filmed in very different styles, of course. Frankenstein is a big widescreen film, 3D, of course, whereas Dracula is a smaller, more intimate kind of a movie in the not widescreen aspect ratio of 185 to 1. So they both are gorgeous-looking movies. And his cameraman was Ubaldo Terzano, who was Mario Bava's camera operator for many years. He's credited as cinematographer on Bava's early films as a director like Black Sunday and Blood and Black Lace and Hercules in the Haunted World, but it's pretty much understood that Bava photographed those films himself and Terzano was his operator. But he became Cavalier's operator after he split with Bava, and they worked on films together like Investigation of a Citizen Above Suspicion and Avanti and various other movies. Dario Argento's Deep Red, Lucio Fulci's Lizard and Woman's Skin, and so forth and so on. So
the music is also worth mentioning here.
They both had absolutely gorgeous music scores by a somewhat obscure composer named Claudio Gizzi, who was actually another Polanski suggestion, because when Morrissey was putting together the people to make Flesh for Frankenstein, he wasn't sure who he wanted to get to do the music, and Polanski said, well, I just had this guy do the music for What? Which was kind of a classical soundtrack where Claudio Gizzi arranged various different classical pieces. He had also already worked for Visconti on Death in Venice, so Polanski said, you should try this guy. So Morrissey hired him to do Frankenstein, loved his music so much that he brought him back to do Dracula as well. They're two of the best scores that I've ever heard for any film, really. beautiful soundtracks.
Jag minns när jag själv såg filmerna Flesh for Frankenstein och Blood for Dracula, eller Andy Warhols Dracula Frankenstein som det då hette. Det var på Fantastisk filmfestival i Lund 1995 om jag inte helt fel. Filmerna var textade på norska och fullständigt sönderklippta. Men det gjorde ingenting. För det är egentligen inte allt blod och våld som var det viktiga i det hela, utan det var de otroligt roliga dialogerna som skådespelarna levererade. Morrissey hade ju handplockat skådespelare från hela världen. Allt från Jude Alessandro, som är en New York-kille med Brooklyn accent, till Udo Kier och Arno Jürgen som pratar med tysk brytning, och alla de här italienska skådespelarna, eftersom filmerna är inspelade i Italien, som pratar med italiensk brytning, och väldigt många av de här skådespelarna kunde ju knappt någon engelska. Och inte nog med att filmerna faktiskt var roliga, det var satir, det var komedi, men när en skådespelare som inte kan prata engelska plötsligt börjar improvisera, då kan resultatet bli fantastiskt roligt, vilket det också blev, speciellt i Dracula, som är enligt mig då det riktiga mästerverket av de här två filmerna.
We'd like the coffin brought up to the room immediately.
First of all, you're gonna have to help me lift the damn thing. And second, it goes in the chapel where Mrs. DeFury says it goes. You want it stinking up the whole house?
Well then, please, can we have the wheelchair brought?
After you help me with the coffin.
Are you our servant for our stay or not?
I'm no one's servant. I'm a worker here.
Oh, excuse me, please. I misunderstood. My vocabulary is not large. I thought worker and servant are the same.
Just don't make that mistake again.
I see. Well, what do guests usually do if need something taken care of?
I don't know. They haven't had any guests here in so long. You'll have to get one of the girls to do it for you.
I'll try to arrange that.
It's the way that Udo Kier says, you know, the blood of these whores is killing me. I mean, it's just the weird pronunciation and so forth that comes out, virgins instead of virgins. I mean, that's not meant, Udo Kier wasn't saying it that way to be funny. That's just with the accent, that's how it came out. That's something that an American produced film, studio film, would have said, oh, we've got to redub this guy, you can't understand him. But thank God they didn't do that, because he is very, very funny.
My body can't take this treatment anymore. The blood of these whores is killing me.
In Frankenstein, he has some great scenes where he flips out on Arno Jürgen's character. When Jürgen says about, going to the brothel, you disgusting creature, you. I mean, he's hysterically sort of prissy and funny about, being disgusted by sex.
To know death, Otto, you have to fuck life in the gallbladder.
I know when I first saw these two films, if you can believe this, I can't imagine them doing this now, but there's a TV, well, we still have a channel in America called the USA Network. And back in the 80s, they used to have on Saturday nights, they would run a program called Saturday Nightmares, where they would run a horror film, followed by a few different sort of scary shows, and would last, all told, like 3 or 4 hours. And they used to run films like Andy Warhol's Frankenstein, as they called them then, Andy Warhol's Frankenstein, Andy Warhol's Dracula, and Ken Russell's The Devils, if you can believe this. I can't imagine these movies being on TV now. Now, they were cut. They were very, very badly cut because, of course, there's a lot of sex and nudity and gore. But nevertheless, what a weird thing to see on just a Saturday night movie. And I didn't get them as a kid. I thought they were terrible because they weren't a Hammer Frankenstein or Dracula. They weren't the Universal. I didn't get it. I totally didn't understand it at all. It wasn't until many years later when I was in my, late teens or early 20s that I finally watched them again. I was like, oh, these are brilliant. But they were not, I don't think they were well regarded when they came out, especially in America. They were not well reviewed, to the best of my knowledge. The critics really tore them apart, and they didn't understand the humor. It's like you said with Morrissey getting upset that audiences didn't laugh. I think people are sort of conditioned when they go in to see a horror film that they're either, they're not going to laugh, or if they do laugh, they're going to laugh at it as opposed to with it. It's incredible. In hindsight, looking at them now, I just watched them again, both of them the other night, to sort of prepare for this, and I was laughing so hard at different scenes. So many wonderful lines. I love in Dracula where Arno Jürgen goes into the goes into the tavern and asks the innkeeper, about the families in the area and so forth, and he finds out about the Di Fioris, and he asks the innkeeper, are they religious? And the innkeeper says, well, I'm sure they're religious. They have a very nice house.
We know that Italian people are very religious and keep their daughters virgins.
Oh, well, but we know so many nice families around. Why don't we introduce them to the Belfiore family, for example? The girls are so beautiful.
Not the oldest one. She never got married. She's a real tramp.
But my God, how can you ever say so? She was all prepared to go to the convent, and she had all her dresses ready to join the Ursuline order.
Are they religious?
Oh, I'm sure they are religious. They have a very nice house.
When I listened to the audio commentary on the Criterion edition of Dracula, I was shocked by how pretentious it was. I mean, this in all honesty is just a very funny, gory, sleazy, artsy satire. And that's great, I love it, but making it into something bigger, it's just silly.
Morrissey or Udo Kier are pretentious on the track, but they have a film professor, which can be fatal. He's bringing in all kinds of symbolism in a very pretentious way, but he never talks about the humor. He never talks about what's funny about it. Frankenstein, for example, I've never had the experience, I don't know if you have or not, but I've never seen the film in 3D, unfortunately. I can tell from watching the film that 3D is used extremely well, but it's used in a way that really does comment on how vulgar it is, because there's a scene in the brothel, for example, where Joe D'Alessandro, who is much more sympathetic in Frankenstein than he is in Dracula, comes in with his friend, and there's 2 or 3 prostitutes there, and one of them's a rather large woman with gigantic breasts, and at one point she literally just walks up into the camera, and the screen is just full with these tits jutting out in 3D. D'Alessandro is having a threesome with the 2 prostitutes at one point, and his foot is jutting out at the front of the frame, and it's just, you're always getting things being sort of thrown at you within the frame that would be really interesting effects to see in 3D, but you can still appreciate them seeing it flat. This professor, or Maurice Yakawar was his name. He wrote a book called The Films of Paul Morrissey or something like that. And he I don't know how to describe him except to say, you say pretentious, fair enough, almost joyless. It's like he doesn't quite understand how funny and how witty these movies are. So you have Morrissey on the commentary giving some very good basic nuts and bolts sort of notes about the film and, how they were made and all that stuff. Udo Kier being Udo Kier, which is to say funny and outrageous and just unpredictable. And then this Maurice Yakawar who just drains the life out of it every time he starts talking about the sort of symbolism. A lot of what he says isn't inaccurate, but the way it's presented is as you say, very, very dry. And I would say that if you ever listen to them again, just fast forward to the professor when he starts talking. But Morrissey himself, it's very, very clear that he loves that kind of elegance and that kind of glamour, and he really misses that in contemporary cinema. I mean, Morrissey is one of those kind of bitter old guys who really thinks that movies suck anymore, and he doesn't see the 70s as sort of a great period of filmmaking. He sees that as sort of a period of decline. So the stuff that he really liked was really sort of the 20s, the 30s, and 40s more than anything else. But I mean, I myself have never met him or spoke with him. I would love to if I ever had the opportunity. It's just a really fascinating, rather small body of work. And really, after a certain point, after he split with Warhol, he continued to make films independently, using the same methods. He was making films in America again, so they were improvised, and never really with any big-name stars. He did make a film, might have been 40 Deuces, that was one of Kevin Bacon's early credits, but for the most part, you don't get sort of star names in his films. But when the financing kind of dried up and he couldn't get that kind of financing anymore, he just pretty much stopped making movies. I don't think he's made a film in a long time.
You have a friend that interviewed Paul Morrissey. Could you tell me what they talked about?
Specifically, a friend of mine from Germany who does a lot of producing DVD extras and Blu-ray extras for different films. And I should say that Paul Morrissey owns the rights to these two films. I think he owns the rights to almost all of his own films, which is almost unheard of. It's very, very rare that that should happen. So there is actually not an official Blu-ray release of either of these films available. There are bootlegs that are out. There's one from Australia and there's one from Germany, but they are not official releases, and I'm sure if Morrissey ever got wind of them, he would probably have a lot to say about them. I think he's looking to make a deal with a company and get them released, and especially with Frankenstein, to make it available in 3D, which would be nice. I would like to see that. They could both do with really good remastering, so you can appreciate the beauty of the cinematography and the sets even better. But my friend from Germany who interviewed him said that they spoke at great length about these films. He's very proud of them. He loves them both. But again, he's very defensive in a way. And so because the two films were sold in America, as were his earlier films, as Andy Warhol's Frankenstein, Andy Warhol's Dracula, Andy Warhol's Heat, Andy Warhol's Flesh, he's very, very angry when that topic comes up, and very upset that Warhol's name means more. But I guess, Warhol, for better or worse, was a pop culture phenomena in the way that Paul Morrissey never was. But Paul Morrissey was obviously a much, much more gifted filmmaker than Andy Warhol ever was. So the trade-off is that, again, Warhol, his name and his popularity allowed Morrissey to sort of flourish and make the films that he made. But Morrissey himself sometimes got a little bit buried as a result of that. And, of course, also when they talked, the topic of Antonio Margheriti came up. And, again, it just seems to depend. You read one interview with him and he'll say, well, he did this. And another interview he'll say, I never even heard him. I don't know who he is. I'm tired of bringing him up. Yeah, I mean, he, in terms of his attitude towards the films, he's very proud of them. And I think that he should be proud of them because they're both beautiful films. And I wish he would have had an opportunity to make more films like them. But, they almost are kind of exceptions in his career. I know he did make another costume movie later on. I'm drawing a blank on the title. I want to say something to do with Beethoven, but I can't recall the title right now.
Paul Morrissey films are pretty hard to come by. Which ones have you seen, and which one is your favorite? I
haven't seen all of his films, but the ones that I have seen, I think are all very interesting. Hound of the Baskervilles certainly was the worst, and in many respects that's the one he's the least responsible for. But even that has its moments where, again, a lot of people don't. Not all the jokes in Hound of the Baskervilles are funny, and a lot of it really isn't funny. But I think a lot of people who are purists and it kind of sticks in the mud about these things didn't quite appreciate what he was trying to do there, and they just see it as, well, that's not like Arthur Conan Doyle. Well, it's not really meant to be. It's more of a spoof. But, again, audiences don't always quite entirely understand what these movies are meant to be. The most recent film of his that I saw was Mixed Blood, which was from the mid-'80s, which is a good film. But if I had to pick my favorite of all his films, it would be Blood for Dracula. Flesh for Frankenstein would come in after that. And then probably Flesh. I'm very fond of Flesh. But, of course, the other D'Alessandro films are wonderful, too, in their own way. But I think with doing those films in Italy in the incredibly bizarre way that they came together, really almost on a whim, and who makes films like that? I mean, how do you literally finish making a movie one day, take a couple hours break for lunch, and then start another movie? It's just incredible. It's absolutely extraordinary, and it was down to his creativity, but also the fact that he had the top flight collaborators, which were part of the Italian film industry in the 1970s, which was, I think, better than anywhere else in the world. At that time, the craftsmen that they had in the 70s, 60s, 70s, into the 80s, before the Italian film industry collapsed, they were second to none. That he had people like Luigi Cavallo and Ubaldo Toscano and Enrico Job and Carlo Rambaldi and Claudio Gizzi, was just an extraordinary, just perfect storm. Everybody just was in the right place at the right time. And thank God he was able to get Udo Kier, who was just, perfect. I mean, you couldn't have a better, more imperious and temperamental Baron Frankenstein, or a more sort of pitiable, sickly, pathetic Dracula than he provided.
I'm pretty curious how much money these films made. I've tried to look it up, but the only things I've found were on Wikipedia, and Wikipedia is not really to be trusted. Obviously, they were not a big success because Morrissey didn't make any more films for a long, long time after this.
I can't think too much. I can only assume that I don't know as much as I would like to know as far as what the box office reception was. I can assume that they probably weren't tremendously successful, because I would think that if they were, that they might have found a way to get Morrissey to make some more movies in Italy, and that didn't happen. I wish it had, because I really think that it was just a perfect marriage of a very clever, very smart, intelligent filmmaker. Even if he's loaded with contradictions, as we said, he's a possibly a homosexual, Catholic, right-wing conservative, but yet at the same time very clever, very intelligent, and imaginative, working with these great technicians. I wish we could have done some more.
Ja, det var allt för den här gången. Mitt namn är Henrik Möller. Musiken är skapad av Testbild. Hej då.